I got to tell you my quick story first. I remember when I first went on the set of The Shield, and I think it was before it began, and they were out shooting at Prospect Studios. It's deep in LA. And Solberg, the publicist for the show at the time, he found some quiet alcove that I could interview Michael Chiklis, who obviously is Vic Mackey. And I remember it vividly. Chiklis came in a very tight black shirt, and of course his tight jeans, and of course that fabulous bald head. And he would pace excitedly as he was talking about it. And while I'm taking notes, I had this inner dialogue that I know that I should be paying attention to his description about this rogue anti-hero who leads this corrupt strike team in Los Angeles, but really the only thing that I could focus on was, when did the commish get so goddamn hot? It was so bad, and I could feel the temperature in my face. Anyway, so when Shawn created the show, I'm not sure if I was the demo that he was looking for, but I'm so glad that he and his incredible band of merry men gave us what we're about to talk about today. So anyway, let me introduce them all. First off, of course, the creator and executive producer, Shawn Ryan. My idea of the total man, Kurt Sutter. Next up is the wonderful Glen Mazzara. Scott Rosenbaum. And the one and only Charles Chic Eglee. The quick question from the very beginning. Where were you? Can you still, to this day, remember where you were when you came up with the idea, how it all came about?
I'd been a guy who'd been struggling trying to decide whether to be a comedy writer or a drama writer, and as a result, I wrote a lot of comedy scripts and a lot of drama scripts, and I had spent 2 years working on Nash Bridges, which was kind of a hybrid show. It was an hour-long show, and it had a lot of cop and PI tropes and story structure, but there were also humorous storylines. But I had sold a sitcom pilot to Fox Television Studios. I'd essentially been hired to write one. There was no idea, and I spent about 6 months banding about different ideas of different sitcom ideas I could write, and I was always chasing what I thought networks were looking for, what they told me different networks were looking for, and enough time had passed and they never heard an idea that they liked enough, and I think they realized that pretty soon the option would expire and it would be over and I would never have turned in a script. And I'd gone on police ride-alongs up in San Francisco as part of the Nash Bridges experience, and for those of you who saw Nash Bridges, you can imagine that being in San Francisco, in the worst parts of San Francisco, on midnight on Saturday nights, did not exactly deliver lots of story ideas for the show that was Nash Bridges. But it did inspire me about what I saw. I realized I didn't recognize on television. And I thought there was a tone and a sense of character that wasn't there. And so I remember the very first idea that became The Shield, I was in an unmarked police car in San Francisco thinking, I don't see this on television. How could it be on television? And then it was just a matter. I had a new kid at the time, and I was a father worried about how he could protect his little daughter in this big bad world, and I just started writing down notes, and eventually that became the pilot, and I convinced them to, rather than take a sitcom script, I convinced them to let me write this hour-long show that, even though they weren't in the business of making hour-long shows, it was the craziest thing that they agreed to let me do it, but I just sort of wrote it. It just came out. It was something I had to write.
Before we get into the show, I want to address why I believe this panel is together, because if you look at the writing staffs of most Hollywood shows, they don't singularly launch a bunch of different careers, but that was what's so extraordinary about this staff, is what they went off to do, and they were personalities in their own right. So I was wondering if we could start with you, turn to your left, look at the person on your left, say, what was your, this is what you're going to explain to me, what was your first impression of the person on your left, and then describe what their role was in the writer's room. What role did they fill? What character did they write for?
Well, the first thing I remember was that Kurt Sutter had written a West Wing spec script. That's what I read that made me interested in meeting him. And I think I've mentioned this to you, but I remember thinking it was a really, really well-written, really, really good script. I read a lot of specs, and this was definitely one of the better ones. There was a very kind of what I felt was a slightly saccharine ending to that script. And I remember writing down, really good writer, wonder if he has enough edge to write for the Shield. And then I met him, and after the meeting, I was like, yes, he's got enough edge. And what I really appreciate, you know, I've lived a relatively clean, somewhat boring life. And I don't know where my inspiration for dark shit comes from necessarily, but it comes mostly from my imagination. What I really appreciated from Kurt was he sat down and he was very open and honest in the very first meeting he had with me, you know, about various issues he had dealt with in terms of alcohol and drugs and overcoming them and living in that kind of world, you know, at one point. And I thought that was a very valuable perspective to have. And then he's just an amazing, amazing draft writer. So I would say that, you know, his role on the show was kind of agitator. You know, more than anyone, he wanted, you know, he didn't want the show to ever fucking sell out. You know, and none of us did, obviously. And sometimes Kurt's pitches were too far, that he'd have to be reined in. But he was just, you know, sometimes he'd be a little bit of a lone wolf. Sometimes he'd be really collaborative. But his ideas were always fresh. They were always different. You know, I always tried to say, what have we never seen before? And let's do that in this episode. And it's hard, episode after episode, to come up with stuff that you haven't seen before. And we didn't always succeed. And nothing would annoy me more than to think we'd written and shot something that we'd never seen before. And then somebody would say, oh, I saw Law and Order Criminal Intent that sort of did that. I'd be so pissed. But that was our attempt to do something we'd never seen before. And Kurt, you know, Kurt embraced that. Is he supposed to talk about Glen? Or?
No, he talks about.
Oh, no, you talk about Glen.
I will say this because I've been kissing your ass all day, and I'll keep doing it. That what you just said is my mantra in the writers' room. I've seen it before. I've seen it before. How can we do something different and get to it organically through character and through narrative? But that has always been my mandate. That's why. You know, all the crazy ass shit we did on Sons was as a result of, nah, that's not, and it wasn't even about like, oh, that's not fucked up enough. It was really just about, that feels familiar, you know? That feels like something, a staple for the genre, which again, I just think it's my job as an artist to, you know, to spin it in, through my vision, and I learned all that from him. Now on to Glen. I'm talking about you.
Oh, is that the exercise?
Yes. You turn to the left.
So you get to talk about Skeeter. That's the up-end. So I came onto the show. I'd never been on staff before. I was completely naive, and as fucked up as I am, I'm, you know, I grew up with all women, right? And camaraderie was really difficult with men because it just was an unfamiliar territory. And I just so desperately wanted to be Glen's friend. And he wasn't down with it. You know, the first time we met, it was just like, I just think you looked at me and went, fuck this guy. That's true. But No, in the beginning, I don't know if you were in your own stuff, but like, it was sort of like, this guy fucking hates me. You know? I remember seeing you in the bathroom. I remember seeing you in the bathroom one time, and like, I was like, hey man, and you're like, yeah. And, but then, I will say.
I think I had my penis out in the bathroom, so I didn't know what you wanted.
Well, that's why I was there. I told you I wanted to be your friend. So, but then, you know, and I'm sure most of that is my imagination, because he probably doesn't, that's why he doesn't remember it. Like most of the stuff, I'd make it up in my head. But I felt like, oh, this guy doesn't like me. And then I remember when I wrote my first script, like, he told me about the conversation he had with Shawn, and you were so like, you know, you went, and sort of like talking about the show, you went, it's pretty good, isn't it? You know, and then I thought, okay, I'm okay, you know, and then, you know, and now, you know, now I love you.
I love you too.
Right. So
when you turned in that script, it was 75 pages long, right? And Shawn came running into my room and was like, "This is the show." I was like, "Yeah, that's the show." Yeah, it was yeah, that was great. But I loved you before that, so you
wasn't the second draft even longer? I was supposed to cut scenes.
It did.
Tighten it up.
Like
By the way, I distinctly remember spending about 3 hours cutting the pages down to getting close to 60. So you never really did cut it down. You loved everything so much.
It was all brilliant.
It was all brilliant. So it fell on me to make those cuts, as I recall.
Okay, so I'm supposed to
Yes.
talk about Scott or Skeeter. So, okay. Skeeter's role on the show, first of all, amazing writer, amazing friend. And what happened was Skeeter and I spent a lot of time together on the show, walking around. We had incredible hours in which I would come in around 10 or 11 in the morning, right? We all would. And then Shawn had the business of running the show and had to do a lot of calls and editing and stuff. So sometimes we would start to order dinner around 6 or 7 p.m. We would eat around 9 or 10. We would then start talking about what we had worked on in the room during the day. And then around 2 or 3, we would break, and Shawn would say, okay, great, go write that, get it on my desk tomorrow by 10 a.m. So there was no time to sleep or whatever. It was that kind of boot camp, and it was fantastic. And so Scott would constantly come in. Remember my couch? He would come in and sit on the couch and just say, so what's going on? What are we doing? What is this? We would constantly have these conversations. And the thing about the Shield was, and the reason we're all so close, it was a completely immersive experience. Like, we lived in that space. Yeah, it was like Big Brother. Yeah, that's exactly what it was like. We lived there, you know, and so it wasn't like we were like a traditional writer's room where you just came in and you presented pitches and you did your thing. I mean, we were literally walking around going, what's going on? What are we doing? What's happening? What about if we do this? Let's challenge this idea. We would pull stories apart and put it back together. And I just remember you constantly coming into my office going, what's going on? Or whatever. But he wrote amazing scripts. The other thing about Scott was he's very worries about his scripts, how they're being received. So a lot of times we had a thing, whenever you wrote a script, everybody, and I still do this on every single show, you get an adrenaline rush when you finish a script and you go, this is the best script ever. It's the best script ever. And then you would constantly come in and go, well, Kurt wrote this great script. My script's not the best script ever. So now you would dig in and just rewrite the shit out of your next script, right? Remember?
Yeah, well, I always went after Kurt, so the bar was very high, and we were both first starting, so there was an immense amount of pressure to deliver, to basically try to trump him if possible. We talked about the competitive nature of the show.
Yeah.
And it was very, very competitive because we all wanted our ideas to get on screen, and some of us, when we didn't, could be angry or petulant. But I think that's what made it so great. But it was that sense of competition, and, like, you know, for me, you know, and Kurt and I were always really close, and we were good friends. But it's like when you're batting after somebody who hits home runs every time, you got to either hit a home run or a grand slam. You got to do that, and it's a high bar to follow. But it actually, I think, helped me tremendously.
All right, to your left.
Can I just say one thing about Skeeter? And first of all, I think you're an amazing writer and an awfully good mentor. So thank you. But Skeeter, when I joined, I was so naive about TV, right? I had no idea. I had this contract. It was like a 7-year option or whatever, and I thought that meant I had a job for 7 years. I'm like so fucking naive that options have to be picked up. And Skeeter, and I love Skeeter now, and he's one of my best friends. But Skeeter knew the dynamic of TV, where there were 2 staff writers on, and more often than not, one of them went away. So,
oh my God, that's right.
And
that's
so
right.
I would come in and I'd be like, oh, da, 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 da. And I'd see Skeeter be like, fuck. And I was like, what's up with this guy? And then I literally went the entire season completely naive, and probably for a really good reason, because if I knew that, it may have shifted my energy a little bit. But then at one point, when both our options were picked up, I went, what do you mean picked up? Right? But then then all the sort of weird competitive stuff sort of just settled in, and I love Skeeter. But do you remember? Yeah, right?
Yeah, I completely forgot that. Yeah.
All right, so Chic Eglee. Well, first of all, Chic had an interesting. The 4 of us were there from season 1 on, and we did season 1 and season 2, and again, I think there was a real big sense of there was a proprietary feeling of, this is our show, we're the ones who did this, why do we have to have a new person come along? And we're capable of doing this show without any other help. And the reality of it was, and Shawn mentioned this earlier, was that we both really had not worked before. He had worked on a show or 2, and Shawn was experienced, but not experienced as a normal showrunner would be in a situation where they've got many years of experience. And so we heard that we were bringing in a new writer, but he wasn't just a new writer. He was this, glossy, Emmy-winning, big shot. And I think all of us were a little, I don't know if we were intimidated necessarily, maybe we were a little bit, but getting back into that competitive thing that, again, and maybe it's just I'm very competitive. It's probably because I played sports my whole life. It's what gets me, I want to win. And so I am very competitive. I'm also very neurotic. So the combination of those 2 make for a very unstable person sometimes. That being said, so he had to come into this room, and I wasn't the only one, I promise you. I probably had, at least it was probably, I kept it inside. These guys, I'm sure it was bursting out of their pores that we don't want some guy to show up. And Chic came in under an immense amount of pressure, and literally within, 24 hours or less than that, we realized why Shawn brought him on. And my first impression of him was he was one of the smartest people I've ever met. One of the things that was fun about doing The Shield is, and it didn't always come out in the text, but it was certainly in the subtext, is that there was a deeper meaning to a lot of the things we were doing. We were really trying to not be on the nose, and so we talked about a lot of deep issues. We talked a lot about American history, police history, and Chic was just an encyclopedia of it. And not only did he have a great brain for all that information, but on all the shows that he'd worked on, he had really learned how to deliver that information in a way that was engaging and dramatic, and very quickly picked up on Shawn's style, which for us was a little hard in the beginning too, which was no shoe leather. You went from point A to point D. We used to always say, well, what about B and C? People are going to get confused. And he would say, they'll catch up. Leave a little breadcrumb, they'll catch up. And Chic just stepped right in, and he was just a gentleman. And when somebody comes in with that kind of experience and immediately can contribute and make a show better, all of the sort of hostility, not all the hostility, but a lot of the hostility sort of disappeared.
I think you were the only one that was hostile.
Yeah. And we realized that we had someone really special, and he fit in immediately, and that's why he's sitting up here with us right now.
Chic's credits, by the way, if you don't know, include Murder One and Moonlighting, but most importantly, NYPD Blue, so you can see why.
Well, it goes back further than that. Chic won't talk about it, but St. Elsewhere was the first show that he worked on. And then he went on to run Moonlighting. So it's just an unbelievable track record. I was thrilled to have him, not only for his talent, but we were kind of in uncharted waters, and I was in uncharted waters, and he'd been a part of shows that were even bigger supernovas than The Shield. When you think about St. Elsewhere and moonlighting in a time of 3 and 4 network universes, he'd sort of been there, and I was so interested. I looked for any excuse I could get to just talk to him about those experiences and what making TV was like in the 80s and 90s, and how Bochco handled things, and how Glen Gordon Caron did things, and and everyone that he worked with, David Milch. I just was a sponge to all the stories he had, and they helped me sort of manage my way through things.
Chic, you get the privilege of laying it all on the line. What was Shawn Ryan like?
I'm not going to.
No, you're over here. You turned to.
I'm not going to pull a Clint Eastwood and talk to an empty chair.
You turn to this dude, Daniel. You get to talk about Shawn. You talk about Shawn.
Let me talk about these guys. I was way too self-absorbed to know that there was any hostility or rivalry. These guys were enormously patient with me. I was coming off of a real train wreck of a show, and feeling very sorry for myself, and I dragged all of that in the room. The Dark Angel experience. What I didn't realize is that, first of all, it had nothing to do with me. It was all about the balkanization of broadcast television, and they were just in a panic over a dystopic show and all of that. So I'd been running that show, and I just wanted, after the politics and it was really, it got pretty nasty, I just wanted to go and be a writer. And that's all I wanted to do. And I wrote a pilot for HBO that was set in LA, and it was sort of about the plate tectonics of race, between, say, north of Pico Boulevard and south of Pico Boulevard, and what that looked like. And I began to get a little antsy not being on a show, and I talked to my agent, and I said, listen, I've sat down and I've watched everything on TV, and the best show on television, far and away, is this show called The Shield, and I'd like to work on it. And they said, well, forget about that. I mean, these guys are, first of all, you're way too old, and you have too much experience, and they have had a bad experience with some senior people, and you're not going to forget about it. So Shawn read my script that I'd written for HBO and invited me on the show. And these guys are all talking about how they didn't know anything, but I came into a writer's room, and yes, it had all been first jobs for people, but it was as game level a writer's room as I'd ever been in, if not more so. And there was this enormous freedom. Of course, I didn't have the perspective that I was getting in on the ground floor of basic cable, because that really was the first show, and it made basic cable. And I just, despite apparently these guys all hated me, I found it, although I do remember when I walked in the room the first time, Kurt, I don't know if you remember, I was talking to somebody and you sat there the entire time with your back to me.
I'm nothing if not passive.
But these guys were coming up with incredibly dynamic, out-of-the-box storytelling. There was nothing, not that I had worked on shows where there was a predictability, because Stephen Bochco sort of invented the notion of coming at things sideways. But this was as dynamic a room and as sure-footed a room as I'd ever been in. And I felt immediately welcomed. Apparently I wasn't. They taught me so much about storytelling that was new and different for me, just the sheer volume of story that you could fit into an hour, which was a different rhythm and a different cadence. And I do remember sitting there one day and we were looking at an Act 3, and I said, no, we can't do that. Because we changed days in the middle of the act. And everybody looked at me and, well, what's wrong with that? And I said, well, you can't change days in the middle of an act. it'll confuse the audience. And people they all looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I realized that that was one of Stephen Bochco's rules that he'd sort of brought along with him probably from his Universal days, that, scenes have to have an establishing shot. You can't change days in the middle of an act because it's too disorienting. So what I realized was that I was really getting on a roller coaster ride where there weren't any rules, or if there were rules, they were being broken. And it's ended up being a singular writing experience for me. And the best several years that I spent in my career ever. And I don't know that I'll ever be able to match the experience I had with these guys, because it was really, really wonderful.
Okay, now you have to bust on Shawn a little bit. That was what you're supposed to do.
Can I just say something? We weren't hostile. We were intimidated, but we were as excited as we were intimidated.
Yeah, good cover.
Just real quick, I just want to point out, just so everybody doesn't think that was all white dudes writing the Shield, that we hoped Liz Craft and Sarah Fain and Adam Fierro could all be here today, and they couldn't. And they were three people who I'd put. Let me put it this way: there was each year on the Shield, we would have a sort of big board that once we broke an episode, we would list 101, Vic does this, blah, 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 blah. And at the end of and for some reason, I don't know what made me do it, but I saved all of those. And then at the end of the run, so there ended up being 7 of them for the 7 seasons. Or were there 8? Because there was one year when we were split half. But anyways, so at the end of it, I had them all encased, and I gave each of the writers one of them from a season. And the 4 there were 7, another 8 because I kept one. I kept season 1, but I gave them all, and it's these 4, and also Liz Craft and Sarah Fain and Am Fierro that to me represented the writers' room at its height. People always ask me all the time what was my favorite season of the show, and from a strictly sort of artistic perspective, I still think season 5 is the best season of the show. And I think the reason why that season was so great, because we had Forrest Whitaker, who was an unbelievable, recurring guest star, but also it was that we had these 4, and Am and Sarah and Liz at the top of their games, and literally all 7 of them have gone on to run their own shows. And when you look back and think about the talent that was in the room, supporting me, it was an amazing, amazing experience.
One thing I just want to say about that I learned also in the culture of the Shield was it was very much an open door. So our support personnel, our writer's assistant and the script coordinator, felt free to come in and be able to talk about story and pitch things from their own life experience, and I think that enriched the show a lot. Randy Huggins,
that's one of I'm so proud. Randy Huggins was a guy that I met on the pilot who was a production assistant on the Bernie Mac pilot, which was sharing office space with us, and I brought him on as our gopher, essentially, season 1. He eventually became a writer's assistant. He eventually co-wrote a freelance episode. I brought him on as a staff writer on the unit. He's gone on to do other stuff, including Power, and then just recently it was announced that he's going to be running a show, for John Singleton for BET. So to see a guy come up literally from the guy who was getting us lunches to now having his own show is something I'm extraordinarily proud of.
Jamie Turner came out of that show. He was the script coordinator, and he's a co-EP, I think, on
some Rosewood.
And I mean, it was a place that really looked to grow writers in the culture of that room.
Okay, I want to move on, but actually, before we dive deep into the content, I just want to start. We got to get back to our ode to Michael Chiklis. Can you go back and?
That's your fantasy, sweetheart.
It is my fantasy. I'm so sorry, and it's like it's a running joke at EW too, but I don't care. Can you go back to the process of finding your Vic, and then what was it like writing for him?
Well, the story I've told before, I don't know if you've heard it or not, but it was a very frustrating experience to find the guy to play Vic Mackey. Nobody thought that anything good could be done on FX. So even if people read the script and liked the script, there was a ton of resistance from agencies, including my own, that didn't want to send actors out and didn't even want offers. Now, it was important to me at that point. I really wanted people to audition because I didn't know who Vic Mackey really was in my head, and nobody was really auditioning. And then I came to find out that Michael Chiklis read the script and really saw it and was wise enough to know that people wouldn't immediately think of the commish as Vic Mackey and knew that he would have to come and improve it. And so about 2 days before Michael came in, I remember turning to Clark Johnson, our director, and saying, I really thought the script was good, but I'm watching all these auditions and, maybe I'm not as good a writer as I think because these scenes just aren't playing well. And, it's not getting to where it needs to go. And then 2 days later, Michael Chiklis came in and he read, and it was long, it was like 3-4 scenes from the pilot. It was like an 8-minute audition. And it was just very intense. And we didn't say a word. He did it. He got it, walked out. I think that audition is actually available on the extras of one of the DVDs. And he walked out, and there was a pause, and I turned to Clark Johnson and said, "No, I'm a great writer." Which I was saying facetiously. I didn't really think that, but it was a lesson that the writing is literally zero without the actor. And the actor's zero without the writing. It is a marriage where we both need each other. And suddenly, words that I thought were good in the order I placed them suddenly were good coming out of the mouth of Michael Chiklis when they weren't good coming out of the mouths of others. And that was a real big lesson to me that my writing can't overcome anything, and maybe the writing's not as good as I think it is, and you got to find the right actor and you have to start writing for them. So he came in, and still, listen, even though it was so amazing, I did go home thinking, because I assumed this would be my one chance to ever create a TV show, and that if it tanked, it might be the end of my career. I mean, believe me, I went home and said, am I really going to put the commish in as the lead of this show? I mean, is that really what I'm going to have, FX to say? I mean, the other FX show that we were competing with at the time had just cast Jason Priestley, coming off of Beverly Hills Now 210. Yeah, it was called Dope. Chris Brancato wrote it, and I've since become friends with Chris, and so I knew we were in competition with this other pilot, and like they've got this sort of real hot star, and I'm going to go to the network and say it's the commish, man. Like it's the fucking commish. And yet we kept looking for. I kept saying, okay, so the script, and I kept waiting for someone else to come in and be at least as good as Michael, and no one ever came close. And so then we brought him into FX, and I was like, well, is he gonna be as good in this audition as he was in that one? And he was. We had brought in somebody else who wasn't nearly as good, and Peter Agori and Kevin Riley looked around and said, yeah, it's Chiklis. I was like, great. and still I was, until we got the cameras rolling, I still was like, I can't believe we're doing this. But it is an ode to him and his talent and his willingness to put himself out there. And he talks about how he read the script and got angry because he knew that people wouldn't think he could do this role. And so he went into that audition with an anger and a chip on his shoulder that completely fed into Vic Mackey. And he'd worked out, he'd sort of changed his appearance, he'd shaved his head, and then we started filming it, and any shred of a doubt that I had kind of disappeared. I mean, you're seeing him do these scenes, the scene where he goes in with the phone book and the razor and the alcohol, and he ends up being the guy. I mean, that was one of the earlier scenes we filmed, and Good Cop and Bad Cop are gone for the day. I'm a different kind of cop. That scene, I mean, oh my God, I mean, it wasn't a case where we had to mine and find, the one good take to use in the cut. Like, if there were 8 takes, 7 of them were great. and in different ways. It was a pleasure to edit him because he would give you different wonderful stuff. And so it's a case of someone knowing they could do it, knowing they had to prove it, and coming in and taking the job from our reluctant hands.
Also, Michael being the number one on the call sheet, I mean, it's an incredibly important job, and the culture of the set, you can live or die by who that number one is, and I had some pretty awful experiences, both before and since. I did moonlighting, so you can imagine what. And Michael was just a can-do guy. And we'd be in a crunch for time because there was never enough time and never enough money. And Michael would go, okay, we can get this, people. Come on, everybody hustle. And he was a cheerleader for the show. And it made all the difference. Just the energy, the intensity, and he was always prepared. I mean, he always knew his stuff. And I remember being on the set one day, we had an actor who was sort of late in our run who didn't really sort of fit into the mix particularly well. And he showed up on the set and was in the middle of a scene, and he went up on his lines and he went, okay, cut. And Michael just came over and slammed him against the wall and said, this is my set. First of all, learn your lines, but nobody says cut on this set unless it's the director or me. And he wasn't saying that out of any sort of ego or proprietary sense. He was saying it as somebody who felt like he was the coach of that crew down there, and he really was. And I think that all got on the screen.
Yeah, I remember reading once how the Cheers writers started taking delight in writing lines that no actor could possibly do to see if Kelsey Grammer could pull them off. And I remember that because we would write difficult stuff to say, and occasionally Michael would come to us and say, guys, this line, this and that, and oftentimes, I or one of the writers would just be, yeah, not the greatest line, probably gonna be difficult, yeah, you probably can't pull it off, and he'd take that shit, let me try, let me try, I'm gonna try. And most of the time he'd pull it off.
Yeah, he
would take it as a challenge, and so there were so many times where if it was other actors, we would have simplified it or toned it down, but we'd just see if Michael could do it.
No, and the other thing is that, since The Shield, I've done a number of shows, and, you have to think this was the lead of a network show in the past, the commish. So Michael was always a mensch. He was always very protective of the written word. And unlike other shows, he never sat down and said, okay, this is my show. Let me give you guys notes. I remember him saying, we started putting out some of these scripts, and we were doing some really, crazy stuff. And we started getting word back from some people on the set, like, what are you guys doing? Can we do this? Are they going to shut us down? Is this going to be allowed? And Michael said, let them do it. Let them figure it out. Like, he protected the writers. He always, was about the script and what was important. And he never looked at it as a star vehicle that, this was his show. He was protective of the show, but it was never that this show is here to service me. He was always in service to the show.
Can I remember... I like so vividly as if it happened this morning. When Chickless walked in the room, we had that first meeting with him where he came to the office, and I think we, obviously the pilot we shot, and you wanted to introduce him to the writers, right? So I just remember, there I was in like this cholo fucking plaid shirt, tattoos, fucking beanie with the ridiculous hair, right? And this is when he looks at me, he goes, look at you. And that's all he said. And I just was like, is that good? Is that bad? What does that mean?
And then we had him kill you on the show.
Now can you, I wonder if Chickless was the way he was because of the incredible brotherhood that you formed with the strike team, and obviously you're talking about Curtis and Ronnie and incredible Shane. Is that what, since I've been on the set, I saw that the camaraderie that those guys had, which is incredible, something that I've seen obviously emulated on Sons of Anarchy as well. But is that something that just blew you away? You didn't see that coming a mile away, that these dudes would be so connected?
Well, I hope to. You know, I'd grown up playing sports and had spent a lot of time in locker rooms. And to me, the strike team was all about locker room mentality, both good and bad. The locker room mentality is not always the greatest thing. But there is a camaraderie. I think anytime you put a group of men or men and women, anyone together in situations that are dangerous, and they rely on each other for each other's lives, whether they're soldiers, whether they're firemen, whether they're police officers, I believe that there's a bond that starts to get created. Now, not to compare what we were doing to those professions, because that's real life and we're make-believe, but it was a very arduous production. We were putting our actors in really tough locations. They did not have great star trailers, our actors, to retreat into. We were shooting 9-10 pages a day. And so, in their own way, they were going through a shared traumatic experience making the show that I think led them to really, really bond. You know, because a lot of the Dutch Claudette stuff was on our sets. You know, it'd be in the interrogation room, and all of David Acevedo's stuff was like in his office. There was those strike team guys that had to go into some of the worst neighborhoods of Los Angeles and film till 5 in the morning, you know, where drug dealers were upset that their corner was being shut down for production, and did we need a security officer for the night? And yes, we did. You know, so those are the environments that they're in. And so I think, all 4 of them just naturally liked each other, but B, that shared experience really, I think, started to show up on screen, to the point where I think if you secretly asked any of them, they would probably admit that they enjoyed doing their scenes together even more than they enjoyed playing scenes with Dutch and Claudette or David. I mean, they liked that thing. There was something about sort of locking and loading, you know, the shotgun, Glen locking and loading the shotgun, and then marching out into the motor pool to like go after stuff that like got them all jazzed up. And you can't buy that camaraderie, and when you start seeing your cast having it, you're just extraordinarily grateful.
Also, the commitment that each one of them had to their characters was just at an Olympian level, and the best acting ensemble I've ever worked with, and they saw that in each other. And it was sometimes hard for some of the guest stars to come in because the bar was set so high as performers. And I think they just respected each other so much.
Well, and they would commit stuff. Chick, tell the story about the first episode that you produced, you know, where they're filming in the street.
Okay, so I show up on the set, and Michael, we're shooting at Santa Monica Boulevard and Vermont during rush hour and in the morning. And Michael's standing there on the sidewalk, and Guy Ferland was directing, and he was chewing his Nicorette, and he says, "Okay, let's do this." And he spits his gum out, and he says, "Come on." And he goes running across Santa Monica Boulevard in uncontrolled traffic with, you know, no Teamsters driving cars, no police. He's just running out into the middle of traffic, doing the Heisman, you know? And Billy Gerhardt, who was our Steadicam operator, was following him. So these 2 guys are just running out, and the cars are screeching their brakes and swerving out of the way, and then he gets to the other side of the road and turns back and says, "Guy, did we get that? Go again?" You know. That same day, I was standing next to the director, and there was a young lady who was one of our extras who I'd seen over at the catering trailer about 5 a.m., and she was having a conversation with herself about what I don't know, but it was very intense. And she had a very, very short skirt and very high heels. And she was supposed to be in the background of a shot, and her A mark was here, and she was going to walk down the sidewalk, and because we were shooting a scene on the other side of the street. And she's walking down the street, and in the middle of the take, a car pulls over. She leans into the car, starts talking to the guy, gets in the car, drives off, and comes back about 15 minutes later and gets dropped off in the next shot. So, Guy is going, "What's going on?" And we had one of our extras tricking on set. And that was the Shield, you know. I mean, there was this anecdote after anecdote like that. You know, I mean, that same episode, there were these two quite hefty Latina women who were in a brawl in this location we were at, and they were drawing blood and really pounding each other. And I was standing next to Clark Johnson, and he goes, "Are these our people? Can we get a camera on this? Can we get a camera on this?" And so we were, you know, they were just having a fist fight, and we filmed it. And
We scouted out misery, basically.
I remember in editing, they were like, "You gotta see this," and the cameras aren't. And our camera would always sort of pan off all the time. All of a sudden, it's panned off. I'm like, "What? Why are people fighting? That's not in the scene." And they're like, "No, that was really happening."
And one other story that I have to tell. We were shooting down at 77th Street, and that was season 5. And there had been a police shooting of a 13-year-old boy, and the studio did not want us to go down there. And Scott Brazil just went, "Oh, fuck him." And so we were shooting down there, and it was a scene in a crack hotel and stuff. And there was this homicide detective, because we were right around the corner from the street, the precinct, came over, and I'm standing next to him, and he wanted to meet Chickless, and he met Chickless and stuff. I'm standing there watching the shot, and he nods, and he goes, "Very smart of you to have that guy here." And I looked over and I said, "Who?" He said, "That's a Swan Blood's shot caller." I went, "Oh, okay. Yeah, as long as he's here, you're going to be okay." We actually, we like him for a double homicide. We were interrogating him, but we let him out so he could be here to keep the peace for you guys, and we'll pick him up after you leave.
Yeah, this is true. There was one time we were shooting a scene in like a drug den or something. We walked in and everyone was literally saying, "Okay, those are real needles. Stand over here," and it was just littered with drug paraphernalia. Yeah.
All right, well, this goes to that. You know how you said you wanted to go for stuff that hasn't been seen before? So with the help of Solberg, we want you to take a trot down memory lane and address these indelible Shield moments that you had and what was the inspiration. So my first one, and I always go to this first before anything, is when Armadillo's face is on the electric stove. I do hope you guys remember that. Remember, Okay, where did that come from? The mind of Kurt? Where did it come from?
In all honesty, was it yours? I mean, it's funny because I get asked a lot who came up with what, and oftentimes I don't remember, and oftentimes is clear. So if Kurt came up with that one, Kurt came up with that one. Oftentimes it's muddier. Somebody will say something, and then somebody else will put a spin or a twist to become, maybe the most famous one. I don't know if it's on your list, but when David Aceveda gets sexually assaulted, I do remember that being a sort of group thing where, well, he gets assaulted, and different people had different ideas on what it became, and so I'm always reluctant to sort of assign credit for like who came up with what. A, because my memory is unreliable. If you guys' memory is better, than great. But B, I also know that usually it was the result of some 20-minute conversation of everybody saying something that led us to this point. That, it was rarely somebody came in on Monday morning at 10 o'clock and said, "I have this great idea, let's put Armadillo's face on a stove." It was always out of the cauldron of the writer's room that this stuff would come.
Stephen Bochco always had a metaphysical explanation for that, because he hated people who took credit for ideas, or because he felt that they were expropriating property that
thanks,
wasn't that wasn't theirs. And his attitude was, that idea wouldn't have happened unless these 5 people were sitting here. So every person present is as elemental to the idea as any other person. And I think that's, for my money, kind of how the Shield operated.
Well, maybe then the question's not who came up with it, but that why did you do it? Why did you burn Armadillo's face like that? Why couldn't you just stab him?
Well, I remember, once again, memory's faulty, and so please correct me, but my memory was that I was starting to get an itch in the back of my brain that Vic Mackey was turning sort of into Superman a little bit, and that wasn't a good thing long term, and that he always seemed to be in control and to make the right move, and that kind of worked for a season and a half, and people really seemed to enjoy it. But I couldn't see that working for 7 seasons believably, and I remember us all talking about how does a guy like that lose control at some point, and how do we visualize that? And so once again, I don't remember the specifics of who suggested the stove, but what I liked about that idea when I heard it was the idea of just this guy drive him nuts, and now he does this really, really horrific thing for, which there's no justifying. A lot of things with Vic, the audience would kind of half justify them. There's really no justification other than he's a shitty dude who's done some shitty things. But what I liked about it, to me, the point of doing that scene isn't even so much the stove thing, but it's when Vic exits the house afterwards, and there's this sort of haunted, pained look on his face. It's not the face of someone who, yeah, I got that guy. It's a guy who knows he's sick to his stomach about what he did. That's what made that scene work for me.
And part of the deal was Danny Pino, who played Armadillo, and they rhyme intentionally. But we loved him as an actor, and we had a longer arc for him. We knew that there'd be some retribution in that, and then it would come back to haunt Vic. So, and I think we had him for the season. So we couldn't we knew we weren't gonna, off the guy in whatever episode, so that it would be a full season arc. So then it's sort of like, well, and I think the other thing, the cool thing about the face burn we realized is that when Vic meets up with him again, he's gonna have that reminder every time he sees this guy. Like, I did that, because his face was brutally, mangled. And we thought that would be cool, because then he's constantly reminded of that sick feeling in his stomach. And that's how does he compartmentalize that and move forward?
Shawn referenced the Aceveda sexual assault, and we were struggling with that character because he had been the precinct captain and had become a city council person. So in order to have him in the show, he was kind of like somebody's weird uncle hanging out around the barn. What's he doing there? And the character became very inert because city council stories weren't particularly interesting. I mean, we tried a couple. And then when we came up with this thing, first of all, it was hilarious. All the women who had been raped and cut up and everything in our show, we put those pages out of Aceveda getting assaulted, and somebody said, "This is godless." Just the double standard that somehow a guy getting assaulted like that. But what that did was to take a character and put him in motion through the rest of the run of the show. Because there was vengeance, and he'd hooked up with Anthony Anderson's character, and he was exploring his own troubled sexuality and the response that evoked in him, and it just made that character incredibly interesting when he had been kind of just there.
We're almost out of time, so I want to give. Does anyone have any questions out here? Just raise your hand and speak loudly. Anyone?
I have one.
Go ahead.
I'm really curious about this. It's fascinating that you're just genius people who get together in a room and come up with these stories week after week for 7 years. But one of the comments you made earlier, Kurt, was about something that you intended in a script. So can you explain a little bit briefly the process in terms of, are you each all writing a script of your own and then joining each other in a room?
She's asking about this process of writing a script.
Yeah, I mean, what's difficult about that show and most serialized shows is that you can't really break episode 4, for instance, until you've really finalized what episode 3 is. So as a group, we would be in the writer's room, and oftentimes we would, there would be A stories, B stories, C stories, sometimes D, E, F. We may have gotten to a G story once on an episode. That's when I knew we were in trouble. But we'd break one story at a time, so we wouldn't worry about where they'd go in order. But so let's break the Dutch and Claudette, murder story of the week. What we're going to do here, what are we learning? And so by the end, we'd have probably 25, 30 A story beats. We'd have 15 B story beats. We'd have 10 C story beats, and maybe 4 or 5 D story, Vic family beats or something. And then as a group, we'd sort of put them together in the order. And then, like I said, we did sort of outlines or story things for like the first 4 or 5 episodes, but none after that. And the writer would go off and write the episode. And then everyone would get the script, and we'd meet in the writer's room. And everyone had read the script, and I gave everyone a chance to weigh in on everyone's script. So a staff writer, could give notes on my script, for instance. Usually what happened was that we had a lot of time at the beginning of the year, and when they're referencing the late nights, that was usually near the end of the year. That wasn't a constant thing. So usually at the beginning of the year, I'd give every writer an opportunity to write a solo script. Usually, although maybe in season 3 or 4 we skipped that. But usually do solo script, and then in the second half I'd pair them up. Kurt and Skeeter wrote a lot of scripts together. For instance, Glen and Adam, I recall writing scripts together, and they'd come in, and usually I'd have notes, and everybody would have notes, and then they'd have to go off and rewrite. A lot of shows, they sort of take the script out of writers' hands pretty quickly, and the showrunner will then sort of put his imprint on it. I always, probably through my own laziness, would have them do 3, 4 rewrites until it got pretty close. And then I would sort of take it to my office and do 2, 3 hours of noodling and some line changes, and then that's what would go out, and that's how the scripts were written.
Yeah, and sometimes you would, maybe if we were running out of time, somebody would write a story. So if I had a script with my name on it, you would write one storyline and you would write a storyline. Then they would give me those pages, and I would kind of tie the script together and polish. And so people were constantly giving, notes on everyone else's script. We'd go to a table read, and then afterwards the writers would sit together and say, oh, this line played better, or how about this, or whatever. So we were constantly, there was a checks and balances, I guess, or however you want to say it, where everybody was participating in everybody else's material as well.
So every episode, all of you were a part of it.
Yeah, it's funny that they talk about how competitive they were, because I actually preached the opposite. So that shows my lack of leadership skills. Because I was always preaching, because it had been preached to me on previous shows I worked on, that no one's going to make their career off of episode 307 of The Shield, right? We can make if The Shield is very highly regarded, it's going to reflect well on all of us. So to me, I was always saying, it's your responsibility to make every episode great, whether your name's on the script or not. So I'm a little disappointed,
Well,
Skeeter.
let me clarify that. When I say competitive, I don't mean, like, for instance, we were competitive in that we wanted our ideas to be on screen. And so, for instance, you wouldn't hold back. So when we were breaking the story, if Kurt had an amazing idea or Glenn had an amazing idea, he would not pitch it, he would pitch it. But we were all trying to get our ideas past Shawn, and that's what I mean by competitive. But in terms of, but never did we not collaborate and help each other out. So it's a little different.
I do like, though, and I don't think I'm making this up, that you also encouraged people to be proprietary in terms of like taking.
Once the script was done,
yeah.
I was like, regardless of how much rewriting I did or how much, or whether it was a gangbang at the end of the year, but if your name's on the script, you go to set and own every word of that and defend the script as your own, on behalf of the show. And we never, there was never any, and I believed in that, and there are some shows where the creators, they do a lot of rewriting and they suddenly throw their name onto the writing credit, and I never believed in that. And I also knew that whether it was a script of Skeeter's that, I had to rewrite some scenes, I also knew that Skeeter was helping rewrite other people's scenes. There was no point in getting, down to the gritty nitty of that and take pride in this episode. And just because on that show, just because you finished writing the episode, just because the script's done, doesn't mean that there's not more writing to do as you get to set, and actors have questions and directors have questions, and the production of those episodes was every bit as important, if not more important, than the writing of them, and making sure not only that the right words were said, but said for the right reasons on the day by the actors, and that it was important to have the moral authority of the author of that episode in order
It's
to
so
do
nice.
so.
You guys are being so sweet to one another. Like, but we have to wrap it up. But I can't end this without asking you, where is Vic now?
You're the second person today to ask me that question.
Was Kurt the first?
No. And here's the honest answer, and it's the answer I usually give, which is that I have some ideas where Vic Mackey is, but I don't know where Vic Mackey is until someone puts me in a writer's room with a group of these people and some people that aren't here and give us a week to sort it out. Because usually my first idea instinct isn't the right one. So I have some thoughts. I'd love to hear their thoughts, and I'd love for somebody to pay us, for a week to sit in a room and give
Guys,
everyone
let's
an
start the
answer.
campaign. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.